If you are currently leveling up your Django skills with this tutorial is part of a free YouTube playlist. The link to the whole playlist is in the video description. Now, if you love this tutorial and playlist, then you might also like to check out the whole course, Django Database ORM Mastery on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, can be found in the video description. In addition to building this very simple test, there is a little bit of setup here. I'm going to maybe change some of the folder names to reflect the changing and evolving testing environment that we are building. Let's start off by changing, renaming, restructuring our test environment. So within the Django inventory folder in test, we currently have cache. I'll just delete that for now to make it easy for us to see what we're doing. So we have our utilities. That's our test database container, generating our test database container. Okay. So in inventory, we have a folder called models and then structural. So I'm just going to make a few changes here. So let's say inventory, new folder, database. What are we testing? The database. And let's do that. And then let's create a new folder inside of that, call that structural. Okay, so in this folder, we're going to find all these structural tests for our database for the inventory app. Is that clear? Structural tests for our database for our inventory app. And then we'll do the same thing, but this time instead of models, let's just rename models to Django model. And inside of there, structural. So hopefully that creates a clear definition or distinction, between our Django model structural tests and our actual database. Now that database could be called migration structurals. So we are essentially performing a sort of migration test here, if you like, in that we are migrating our models to the database and then testing. Of course, this is the initial migration. So it's up to you whether you want to name that maybe migration, but I'm going to call this database structural, Django model structural. So we're going to now place all of our tests within this database structural folder. Now let me just show you this. Let's just grab our existing category test, structural tests. Let's move it into, I've just copy and pasted that into the structural folder. And now I'm going to run Pytest. So I'm not going to run Pytest there. I need to change directory into my project and then run Pytest. Okay, so we can see here that we're told that our modules, they must have a unique base name. So in actual fact, we cannot name this test category. So we're going to need to think about a new testing naming scheme. Now, what we might like to do ultimately is change the names down here in the models, our existing tests. So maybe this is called test model attribute, attribute being the table name, or attribute value being the table name in this case. So this would be test underscore model category. We might like to follow that approach, but this is something that you need to think about because we cannot have we cannot have the same name, same module name twice within our testing environment. So I'm going to change this to test database category for now, or maybe test structural database. Let's just go for test database category, although it's not very clear, is it? So let's test DB structural category. Now this is a very organic development, but you can hopefully start to see the importance potentially of planning ahead, because you end up having to go back and it just produces or creates more work for you. I do try to plan ahead when building courses, but I end up making changes anyway. Right, so now we have our first module in place. Let's remember that we are working through our tests. Let me just close. I'm going to keep that open. Let's just go to the docs testing. Now, you might not find this file. However, if you download the source code that you can find a bit further on from this module, you will find this. And the likelihood is that I have added the the code, the source code, if you go to the end tutorial, at least in this module, you will find the source code, or the final source code, where you'll find this post-migration structural testing markdown file if you want to take a look at it. Right, so the first test. So the first test and this tutorial, we're going to focus in on confirming the presence of the table within the database once it's been migrated from our Django model. A very simple test just to make sure that our database table has been created. So let's take a look at what we have built so far. This was a test to test that our model, our category table, exists in our Django model. So now we simply need to recreate this test. But remember, this time we're testing to make sure that the migration was successful. The category table has been built successfully. So in terms of what happens when we build this test and run this test, let's just take a quick recap. Now, we run Pytest. Okay, so we initiate Pytest. What's going to happen is it's going to scan for our test, find the test it's going to run, and then it's going to run our test. So it will find our test. So let's just call this test 1 for now. That's the test that we're going to build. Right, so it's found this test. It's then going to run this test. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to declarate this test to tell Pytest, in actual fact, this test requires a database. So we need to tell Pytest that before we run our new test that we're going to build. Now, remember, what happens from here is that Pytest will then run the setup code to run the Docker test database. So that will then get created. Once that's done, don't forget the migration of our Django models will take place. And then once that's done, Pytest will then go ahead and run our test. So that's the workflow behind the scenes. All we need to do now is create the test and tell Pytest that we want to use our test database. Right, so let's do this. Let's get rid of that for now. I'm going to just copy this top section from the previous. Oh no, we are in the right section. Okay, so let me just remove all this other stuff. I'm just going to focus in on this one test. We remove the existing test code, and now let's think about building our test. So the first thing that we need to learn is how to actually tell Pytest that our test that we're just about to run requires database, or our test database. Now, to do that, remember we have installed Django Pytest, and that allows us then to utilize or to define a Pytest mark, which will initiate and allow access and set up our database, test database, for our test. So for that, we simply run pytest.mark, and that's going to be the Django DB. Now, we could set this up in many different ways. We're just going to add this to every single test that requires access. We could set up maybe a fixture which can be set so that any tests within here is just automatically then assigned and allowed Django database access. We could work here in multiple ways. We're going to keep this nice and simple and just define the fact that this test requires database access by utilizing this Pytest mark. So let's just make sure we have Pytest. Okay, we do. That's already there. So let's go ahead and build our test now. So we're going to set up our test model migration structure table exists. Okay. Now what you noticed already, if you remember from the previous test, we set up the name of the test to be as descriptive as possible, so that should you see it in the outcomes of running tests, maybe there is a problem, makes it easier for us to identify the test. And here, obviously, just reading through the code, it makes it easy for us to understand what we're testing. We're testing to see if a table exists after the migration. Now, what we have here is a separate keyword. If you remember previously, we set up in Pytest a number of different marks or custom marks that represented different types of tests we might want to run. Because what we can do by creating our own marks, it means that we can run specific tests. So if we only want to run, for example, model tests, then we can do that by running Pytest and specifying the model mark. And any tests that have the name model in it will then run. So here we have this keyword migration. So let's think about now changing our Pytest markers to add a new mark. So let's call this model migration. So this is a marker test as a model migration structure or structural test. Okay, so we have this. So this is matching, if you remember, what we have here. So what we're going to do now is add the code, which is going to run before we run any tests. It's going to look for all of our tests, look for names that match model migration. It's going to automatically add the Pytest mark to it, so that should we, when we run our Pytest tests, specify a marker, in this case model migration, it will only run those tests which has the name within it, model migration. Now, if that doesn't make sense, do apologize. I tried to explain that. If you go back a few modules, I think 2 modules, I have explained and given a much more in-depth explanation of Pytest marks and what we're doing here in terms of setting this up. But let me just show you. So we've created our custom mark, step number 1. So step number 2, if we go into our fixtures here, you can see that isn't the fixture. If we go into our utilities, where have we got that? Oh, sorry, it's in our Pytest file. Apologies, I thought I added a separate utility or fixture for this. So at the moment, you'll find the code in the Pytest file here. You can see what we're doing here. Before we run the tests, we are iterating over the tests, and then we're looking for the name of each test. We're looking through the name of each test that the Pytest has found before it runs tests, and it's going to add a marker based upon the if statement here. So let's just expand that now to include our new marker. So we'll just add an additional if here for now. So if the name or the text model migration is found in the item, which is the actual test in this respects, the name of our test, then we're going to add the marker automatically to the test. And that way we can then filter out tests to run specific tests. Because once you start getting into the thousands of tests and different types of tests, testing can take a very long time. And it might be that you just want to run specific tests. So this would be nice and quick, or much quicker than running every single test. Right, so there we go. Now, apologies, I'm always second guessing whether I've given you enough information. So just to confirm, we run Pytest. Behind the scenes, Pytest is going to gather or collect all of the tests that it can find. And then what's going to happen is going to look for the name of all tests. So it looks for the name of all of our tests. Where it makes a match, where the name makes a match to what we've just specified in our if statements there, is going to add a new marker to that test. And what that means is that when we run Pytest and then specify, for example, /m, and then maybe model/migration, then what's going to happen then is Pytest is going to collect all the tests. It's going to look at all the names of the tests. It's going to make a match. It's going to add the marker. And where this marker matches what we specify when we run the test, it's only going to run those specific tests. Right, so I'm not too sure if that makes any difference. Hopefully you get the general idea of what's happening. Like I said, if you take a look at the previous modules, I have explained it in more details if you haven't already watched that. Right, let's build a test. Right, so first up, all we're going to need to do here is to check to see if the actual model has been successfully migrated to the database. So let's give this a go. So we're going to add a try try except block. So from inventory dot models, let's go ahead and import category. Okay, so with that done, we're do an exception here, import error, assert false. So we're just going to check to make sure it exists first before we run the test. We don't have to do that, but I've added that there. Right, so now we have the else. So if the category table does exist, let's run a new test. So let's say table names equals connection dot introspection dot table names. Okay, so what are we doing here? So in Django here, this command is used to retrieve a list of table names in the connected database. So we specify the connection. Now this is Django's database connection object, which provides an interface to interact with the database. Then we have introspection tools. So we specify introspection. So this is a module within Django that provides methods for inspecting the database schemas and structure. We aren't going to use this too much in actual fact. We are going to work with the Postgres database introspection tools. So this is just something a little bit different, and just to point out and to make a note that Django does provide us a range of tools, and you can check out the documentation for that. So we're going to use Django here, connection.introspection.table names. So table names, so that obviously is a method within the introspection tools that allows us to return a list of all the table names present in the database. So what we will need to do is to bring that resource in. So models, which we don't need anymore. So that was just code. So let's bring in the integrity error, which I don't think we need at the moment, actually. Let's not do that. So let's import the connection. That's what we're using. Apologies. Right, so we've got the connection. Let's table names. Okay, so now we need to do an assert. Create an assert. Now we want to check to make sure that the category table actually exists within the database. So what we're going to do here, we're going to need to get the meta.db table in table names. Now remember, the Django model, that's a class. So it has a class name. We don't want to use that to match against the actual database. Now remember what happens when we migrate the category table from our Django models. Django utilizes the class name to form part of the actual table name. So we're going to grab the actual table name by moving into that model, getting the meta.db name. That's going to then return the actual database name that's been used to actually create the database table in the database, and table names, and we're going to check that against the table names that we've collected from the database. So step 1, collect all the table names from the database using Django introspection tools. Step number 2, assess whether the category name as defined within the database is actually stored or actually have been created in the database. So with that done, let's go ahead and give us a go. So now when I run Pytest, it does take a little bit of time, of course, because we are building the test database. So that's going to take a little bit of time to build. So here you can see that I have done something wrong here. I've used plural, apologies. Should be table names, not tables, names. So let's just try that one more time. Again, it's going to take a few seconds to build the test database. That is something that we could have a look at to make it a little bit quicker potentially. But you can see that we have now all the tests have been created. Now we have already completed, or we already have created a sanity check by making a mistake here in our test. So it does look like everything is working as intended. And in actual fact now, remember what's happened behind the scenes. Our test database has been created. The migrations have been performed. So the tables were created successfully within that test database. And now we've actually tested the tables in the Postgres database in our Docker container. And there we go. First test completed. Now, apologies, there was a little bit of additional setup there that I decided just to put all within one tutorial, rather creating a separate tutorial for creating the additional mark and so on. So hopefully the explanations weren't too painful. Apologies if they were. Now that we have everything set up, it should be fairly straightforward to now just focus on building the tests. We will at one point get to a point where there is additional tutorials where we discuss utilizing or building factories and building data for our tests. But for now, we can just focus purely on building the tests. So let's move to the next test case.